Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling a really fascinating book this time, Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott.
Oh yeah, this one's a classic.
It really is. I mean, just that title alone really grabs you.
For sure. And this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on the first chapter.
Yeah, where Scott kind of lays out his main argument.
Right. He introduces this idea of how states simplify complex realities.
Which sounds pretty abstract, but he illustrates it with some really concrete examples.
Yeah, and one of the most striking ones is this metaphor of scientific forestry.
Okay, so tell me about that. Where does forestry come into the picture?
Well, Scott takes us back to 18th century Prussia and Saxony,
Okay.
and he shows how these early foresters were obsessed with maximizing timber yield.
Makes sense. I mean, timber's valuable.
Right. But they were so focused on this one goal that they kind of missed the bigger picture.
Literally.
Exactly. They created these simplified forests, stripping away the underbrush.
Oh, it's like monoculture kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Planting just one type of tree, eliminating diversity.
All in the name of efficiency.
Precisely. They thought they were making the forest more legible.
Legible.
Yeah, like easier to understand and manage.
So like a tidy spreadsheet instead of a wild, tangled ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. And Scott uses some really powerful quotes to drive this point home.
Oh, like what?
Well, there's this one from the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Okay, I'm familiar with that one.
where Gilgamesh is boasting about conquering the cedar forest.
Uh-huh.
He says, I will set my hand to it and will chop down the cedar.
Whoa, okay, so that's pretty,
It captures that mindset of domination and exploitation, right?
yeah, like the forest is just this resource to be plundered.
Exactly. And Scott calls this thin simplification.
I like that phrase.
The state is reducing this incredibly complex ecosystem.
So just one metric.
Timber yield. And guess what?
What?
This backfires spectacular.
Oh, I bet. Monoculture always seems to lead to trouble.
Right. These forests become vulnerable to disease, to pests.
So it's that classic trade-off, short-term efficiency for long-term resilience.
Exactly. And here's where Scott makes this brilliant connection.
Okay, lay it on me.
He links this idea of simplification to how states interact with societies.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How did that work?
Well, think about it. States love taxes, right?
Can't live with them. Can't live without them.
But to collect taxes effectively, they need to know what people have.
Their income, their wealth, yeah.
Exactly. But before modern tools like standardized accounting, things were a lot messier.
Oh, I bet.
Scott gives this great example of the French taille, which was this land tax
Yeah.
that was notoriously unreliable because the state couldn't accurately assess people's wealth.
So it's like they were trying to impose this simplified tax system on a very complex social reality.
Exactly. And just like with those monoculture forests, this had unintended consequences.
I can imagine.
Sometimes they'd collect too little tax revenue, sometimes too much.
Leading to instability and resentment, I'm sure.
Precisely. So even back then, you see this tension.
Between simplification for control and the messy reality of the world.
Exactly. And Scott argues that this struggle for simplification, it shows up everywhere.
Give me an example.
Well, one of the most fascinating ones is the evolution of measurement systems.
Okay, measurement systems. What do they have to do with state control?
Well, before the modern era, measurement systems were all over the place.
What sense?
They were incredibly diverse and localized, often tied to specific activities.
So like what? Give me an example.
Scott mentions communities that measured distance in terms of 3 rice cookings.
3 rice cookings. That's amazing.
Right. It makes total sense in that local context.
Yeah, you know exactly how long it takes to get somewhere based on how long it takes to cook your rice.
And farmers often measured land not in acres, in terms of how many days it took to plow it or how much seed was needed.
So practical.
It was. But for states, this was a nightmare.
Yeah, all those different systems would make things pretty hard to manage on a large scale.
Exactly. All these diverse localized measurements were illegible to them.
Illegible meaning.
They couldn't easily compare aggregate and ultimately control resources.
So they needed to standardize everything.
Exactly. And this led to this whole power struggle over measurement.
Oh, really?
Scott talks about how feudal lords would manipulate units for their own benefit.
So it's like a constant battle between the state trying to impose its standards.
And local actors resisting or exploiting those standards.
Wow. So even something as basic as measurement is tied up in this struggle for power and control.
Absolutely. And this push for standardization, it ultimately led to things like the metric system.
Okay, so meters, liters, grams, the whole shebang.
Right. Creating this uniform, legible system that could be applied across the entire territory.
It's amazing how something we take for granted, like measurement,
Yeah.
has this whole hidden history of power struggles and competing visions of order.
It really does, and that's Scott's point. This drive for legibility wasn't just about efficiency.
What about
Out of pout. The states need to simplify complex realities.
in order to make them governable?
Exactly.
This is really fascinating stuff. So we've got forests, taxes, measurement systems. What else does Scott explore in this chapter?
Well, he goes on to discuss another area where the state sought to impose its vision.
Which is,
Land tenure.
okay, land ownership. That's a big one.
It is. Imagine a world where owning land wasn't just about having a deed with your name on it.
Okay. I'm picturing something more communal, like people sharing the land and its resources.
Scott describes these complex communal land tenure systems.
That existed.
Yeah, in many pre-modern societies. He gives examples like the Danish Azurlav
Okay.
and the Norwegian Guard, where land wasn't individually owned but held in common.
So it's more about collective stewardship than individual ownership?
Precisely. But for the state, these systems were incredibly frustrating.
Because
They couldn't easily figure out who to tax.
Right, it'd be like trying to tax a river or a mountain.
Yeah.
It's this constantly shifting shared resource.
Exactly. And so to simplify things, the state started pushing for what's called freehold tenure,
Freehold tenure.
where land is owned outright by an individual.
So a much clearer system for taxation and administration.
Exactly. But this shift had huge social consequences.
In what way?
Well, Scott argues that it often benefited elites
Those who could afford to buy up land.
and those who were quick to grasp the new rules of the game.
So winners and losers created by this new system.
Precisely. He gives the example of the Stolypin reforms in Russia,
Okay, I'm not familiar with those.
where the state tried to break up communal land holdings and create individual peasant farms.
Sounds like a radical change.
It was, and it didn't always work out as planned.
Oh, I bet.
It often led to social upheaval and economic hardship.
So another example of how the state's desire for simplification can have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this simplification isn't always driven by malice.
So what's driving it then?
Sometimes it's driven by this genuine desire to improve things.
To make systems more efficient or equitable.
Exactly. But, as Scott shows us, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions.
That's a great way to put it. So what you're saying is that this whole idea of seeing like a state, it's about more than just forests or taxes or land ownership. It's about a whole way of looking at the world.
It's about this drive to simplify, to categorize, to control.
And that this drive can have both positive and negative consequences.
Absolutely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how this logic of simplification extends to something even more personal.
Oh, really? What's that?
Our names.
Names. Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
We'll save that for next time. Join us for part 2 of our deep dive into seeing like a state.
I can't wait.
So, it's kind of funny how we take our names for granted, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's just they're part of who you are.
Right. But Scott points out that this whole system of fixed inherited surnames, it's a relatively recent invention.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's all tied to this state desire for legibility.
Okay, I'm seeing the pattern here. Simplify, standardize, control.
Exactly. So how do names fit into this? Well, before the modern era, naming practices were much more fluid.
Fluid, how so?
Like people might have multiple names depending on their age.
It's almost like nicknames, but more formal.
Kinda. It worked perfectly well in small communities.
That everyone knows each other, yeah.
But for the state, this was a problem.
Another illegible system.
Exactly. Made it really tough to track people for taxes, for the military, for legal stuff.
Right. Imagine trying to create a census when people's names are constantly changing.
Yeah, total chaos. So to create a more legible population,
Accepted?
they started pushing for fixed inherited surnames.
So your name is tied to your family line. Makes it easier to track you through generations.
Exactly. Scott gives these cool historical examples like the Qin dynasty in China. They imposed surnames as early as the 4th century BC.
Wow, so this goes way back.
It does. And he also talks about the Florentine catasto.
The what?
The catasto. It was this attempt to create a super detailed census in 1427.
Okay.
They wanted to register everyone and all their wealth.
Sounds ambitious.
It was. And it ultimately failed.
Oh, so they couldn't quite pull it off.
Nope. Too much complexity, I guess.
But even though those early attempts struggled, the idea of fixed surnames eventually stuck.
It did. And now it's so normal to us, we don't even think about it.
That's like the air we breathe.
Right. But Scott's point is that this wasn't just about administrative efficiency.
There was a deeper logic at play.
Exactly. It was about shaping how we see ourselves and our place in society.
So giving everyone a fixed identity within the state apparatus.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And this logic of simplification, it extended to other aspects of life too.
Okay, you've got me curious. Now what?
Well, think about the spaces we inhabit.
Like cities and towns.
Yeah, exactly. Scott contrasts the layout of traditional cities,
Okay.
like Bruges, which he describes as like a maze.
Hard to navigate.
Super hard. You'd need a local guide just to find your way around.
And he's suggesting that this wasn't just by chance.
Right. He suggests that this illegibility actually served a purpose.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It made it harder for outsiders to control these spaces.
Including the state.
Exactly. So the very layout of the city could be a form of resistance.
That's fascinating. But then things started to change.
They did. Along came the urban planners.
With their grids and their straight lines.
Exactly. They wanted to create cities that were transparently legible.
So you could see everything from above, control everything.
Precisely. And he uses the example of Haussmann's Paris.
Oh yeah, those grand boulevards.
They were created by demolishing huge chunks of the old city.
And imposing this new rationalized grid system.
Exactly. And Scott argues that this wasn't just about aesthetics.
It was about power.
Right. Those wide boulevards were perfect for marching troops through.
Ah, so making it easier to quell any uprisings.
Exactly. So the city itself becomes a tool of control.
Wow, so it's not just about simplifying physical space?
Nope. Scott argues that this logic extends to language, too.
Language. Okay, now I'm really interested.
Think about it. A common language is essential for any modern state.
For communication, for laws, for education.
It's like the glue that holds everything together.
Right. But language is also incredibly diverse and complex.
It is, and Scott uses the example of France, where the state really pushed for the use of Parisian French.
Mm-hmm.
Starting in the 17th century, they made it the language of law, government, education.
And what happened to the regional dialects?
They were marginalized.
Seen as less sophisticated.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about administrative efficiency either.
It was about creating a unified national culture.
Exactly. Parisian French was seen as the language of progress and civilization.
So language becomes a tool of cultural power.
It does. And those who didn't speak French were at a disadvantage.
Shut out of opportunities.
Precisely. So even something as fundamental as language gets caught up in this logic of legibility and control.
This is really eye-opening stuff. You know, it's making me think about all the different ways that the state shapes our lives.
It does, doesn't it? And what Scott is really getting at is that this drive for simplification.
It's not always a bad thing.
Right? Sometimes it can be beneficial.
But we need to be aware of its potential downsides.
Exactly. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore what Scott suggests as an alternative to this state-centric view of the world.
Okay, I'm definitely coming back for that.
Yeah.
What's the antidote to this seeing like a state mindset? Okay, so we've seen how this seeing like a state mindset plays out, but what's the alternative? Like, is Scott saying we should just reject all forms of order?
Not quite. He's not anti-state.
Okay, good, because I kind of like having roads and hospitals and stuff.
Right. But he's urging us to be aware of the limitations of this top-down simplification approach.
So it's not about embracing chaos, but finding a better balance.
Exactly. He talks about this idea of modus.
Oh, what
Yeah, it's a Greek term for a kind of practical wisdom.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's the knowledge that comes from experience, from being embedded in a specific context.
So not just theoretical knowledge, but like street smarts.
Exactly. It's about understanding the nuances, the things you can only learn by doing.
So like the difference between reading a cookbook and actually being a chef?
Perfect analogy. Mortis is all about those subtle adjustments, those improvisations that you make based on your experience.
It sounds very adaptable.
Yeah.
Very responsive to the situation at hand.
It is. And Scott argues that this kind of Mortis is essential for creating systems that are truly resilient.
Because they can adapt to changing circumstances.
Exactly. He contrasts this with high modernism,
Which is?
that belief that we can solve all our problems through rational planning and technology.
Okay, so like those grand utopian schemes that often go awry.
Precisely. They look great on paper, but they fail to account for the messy realities of human life.
Yeah, it's like those planned cities we were talking about earlier. They might look efficient, but they often lack that human scale vibrancy.
Exactly. And Scott argues that this high modernist mindset can be seen in so many areas.
Give me an example.
We'll take agriculture, for instance. The Green Revolution was this huge effort to modernize farming practices.
Increase yields, feed the world, that kind of thing.
Exactly. but it also led to the widespread adoption of monoculture farming practices.
Which, as we've seen, can make crops more susceptible to disease.
Exactly. So even with the best of intentions, this focus on efficiency and control.
It can create new vulnerabilities.
Precisely. So how do we avoid falling into this trap?
Yeah, what's the antidote to this seeing like a state mindset?
Well, Scott doesn't offer a simple solution.
Okay, fair enough. The world is complex.
Right. But he does give us some guiding principles.
Like what?
Well, he stresses the importance of humility.
Humility.
Yeah, recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
So being open to learning from our mistakes.
Exactly. And he encourages us to embrace experimentation, to be willing to adapt and change course.
So it's less about imposing a grand vision and more about cultivating this kind of flexible, responsive approach.
Precisely. And it's about valuing diversity.
Diversity of thought, of perspectives, of approaches.
Exactly, because those illegible spaces, those messy, unpredictable parts of life.
For often where the most creative solutions emerge.
Exactly. And they're often the most resilient in the face of change.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. It's really making me rethink how I view the world.
That's great to hear. Scott's book is all about challenging our assumptions and encouraging us to see things from different perspectives.
And it's not about demonizing the state or rejecting all forms of order.
It's about finding a better balance.
Between the need for structure and the importance of flexibility and local knowledge.
Exactly.
Well, this deep dive has definitely lived up to its name. We've explored some pretty deep ideas today.
We have. And I hope our listeners have found it as stimulating as we have.
To all our listeners out there, keep those minds open, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the complexities of the world.
And remember, even though the world is messy and unpredictable, that's also where its beauty lies.
Thanks for joining us.